Welcome to the next major question in the German A-level topic. And this is looking at, after they have put themselves into power, how does the Nazi state remain until 1945 seemingly unchallenged, seemingly without much resistance, seemingly relatively stable? And the way I sort of summarize this question is the stability question. Now, in reality, this is actually a series of different questions. Some examples are here, which cover a whole range of different topics. Essentially, what this question is all about is, why is the Nazi state so stable? This could be in terms of, is this the most important reason why it's stable? For example, the first question, is this Hitler is popular? How far do you agree? And therefore the counter-argument would be, no, it's actually the people are scared, and that's a stability question. It can be about the nature of the dictatorship, such as weak dictator or totalitarian, and then obviously there's a factor of like how much terror compared to popularity is in there. If you are depending on popularity, that's very different if you're dependent on terror and vice versa. In addition, there's a large number of questions you can ask or be asked about the nature of how the state rules. Does it rule through buying people off? In addition, it could be based on different social groups. How far are German people obedient? You might say, well, it depends on which social group, because obviously some will be bought off and some will have effective terror. So essentially, it's best in this one not to get hung up too much on individual questions. Obviously, do your essay structures and your essay plans accordingly to the question, but you should be focused on learning the content and the story and the core argument, which will apply to all of those. And that's what we're focusing on in this question. So this is basically a very short video lesson where we sort of introduce you to the sort of broad parameters, the sort of key concepts we need to think about before we go into the major factors, which tend to be longer, particularly the terror one, longer video lessons, could be well over an hour. So essentially, what this question is accessing, what they're trying to do is trying to almost see your understanding of how, when you close your eyes, how does the Nazi state rule? And the debate essentially lies between these 2 points. Either the Nazi state is incredibly unpopular, they only got people to obey them because of pure fear, and everyone resisted as far as they could. And this is the most extreme, almost you could say, apologist position. So this is a position taken from those who want to almost put the German people who were alive during the time in the best possible light. So it's saying, well, the reason there isn't instability, the reason there isn't resistance, the reason why people look like they're going along with it is not because they're going along with it, not because they like the Nazis, not because they like Hitler, but because in fact they are scared, there is terror, and they resist where they can, but the terror network is huge. If you have this position, therefore, you're going to argue to most of these questions, no, it's terror which is the most important reason. Limited opposition is due to terror. Hitler's policies are not popular with the German people. Terror keeps them in line. If you think about those past paper questions we've just looked at, and that's one extreme position which you very rarely find sort of convincing historians take. So that's on one end of the extreme. On the other extreme, you can sort of got the Hitler's willing executioner-esque arguments, which are the Nazis and Hitler are actually really popular. The Nazis are completely supported by the German people. Everyone loves it. They don't just love particular policies. They love the idea of Nazis, and that's all of it. All the stuff, including Volksgemeinschaft, changing society. They love it. And therefore, people have a national consensus. Now, these words will turn out to be very important: consensus versus consent versus conformity. And therefore, the idea, like, people love it. German people almost ubiquitously, apart from a couple of political enemies, are completely in support, and that's why Nazi regime stays stable. That's why there's so limited opposition, and that's in reality, it's just pick of the policies which are the most favourite, and you could go for the most extreme, crazy ones, such as some of the Volksgemeinschaft ones. You will not be taking either of these positions. You'll be taking a more nuanced position somewhere between these. Where you lie is up to you. There's no real right answer. Well, obviously, there's no real answer for this for the purposes of this test. So it's better to think of where can you show the sophistication. What is the sort of middle ground? And remember 75-25 rather than 50-50. Where can you find that sort of convincing They are generally used terror, but there is elements of popularity. Generally, there is popularity, but it's not popularity, it's consent with a bit of terror, that sort of thing. And that's what you should be looking to do. And once you have that core understanding of, like, this is how I think they stay in power, then when you approach these questions, the argument you are going to pitch, and therefore the paragraphs you're going to pitch, and therefore the analysis in that paragraph is going to be very clear. And I get a lot of people come up to me and say, well, what paragraphs do I do for this? What paragraphs do I do for that? Blah, 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 blah. The paragraph should follow what your line of argument is, and this is particularly true in this question. If you go into this going, what's the argument for this paragraph, what's the argument for this paragraph, you aren't going to have a cohesive argument, and therefore you're not going to have much to write in your analysis, because you're not writing to something, you're not writing to prove your line of argument, you're just saying some stuff. So what you really need to make clear is what is your core line of argument for why Hitler came to power, and then every paragraph is servicing towards that. So if we look at how the historiography has developed over time, we see that it has shifted in response to the sort of trends in intellectual history, or the intellectual courses of history throughout the post-war period. So crudely, and I'm actually not, I'm a bit, not quite doing it justice, but the need to accommodate with the German people, particularly the West Germans, in the face of the Cold War, and therefore the bulwark against socialism being the state of Germany, or West Germany at the very least, many of whom's leadership, both political but also civil service, military, police, and so on, were in the government when Hitler was in power. The need to try and keep those in those offices, because it's important in the post-war Cold War era to do so, means that you need to almost try and shove the blame for a lot of what was done onto the Nazis, and particularly Hitler himself. And this is the idea that Germans were not Nazis, and actually it was about terror, and it was about Hitler's oratory ability and the use of propaganda. This basically serves to shift the blame somewhat, and basically explain Nazism, explain the rise of Hitler, and explain the Hitler's stability as a factor of outside forces of which Germans don't have any control. This is basically to absolve Germans of blame. Now, there's a slight shift very quickly when it becomes clear that this is unsustainable with elements of the literature. But in the 60s and 80s, we see a shift towards more social history, more lower level history, and more redefining what we mean by resistance. And everyday resistance becomes very key as an idea across. And this is true for Nazis. Terror is seen is increasingly questioned, and there's an emphasis a bit more on the subtle ways that terror works, rather than many Germans being executed. It's much more about the role of conformity, but also looking at like the non-conformity and the redefining resistance in more fluid ways, i.e. saying, well, yes, resistance is throwing a bomb, but is also resistance refusing to salute, is resistance refusing to send your child to the Hitler Youth, and so on. And therefore, there's a bit of a focus on opposition. In the 1990s and early 2000s, there's a bit more of a shift to the idea that actually there is a role for consensus of support, i.e. people increasingly are questioning whether actually many Germans supported the dictatorship on some level. There's a huge dispute about what they support and the extent to they support, and that's what we're going to be focusing on in this session, defining those words. And therefore it's the idea that actually the Nazis are far more of a weaker dictatorship, and this goes alongside of our sort of demolishing the image of Hitler as all-powerful dictator. And instead, it's a dictatorship which relies to some extent on at least the consent, and in some cases, some historians, the support of the people. And this makes the people far more complicit, i.e. far more responsible for what happened to some extent. So, when we look at this question, we need to think about the major factors what keep stability. So, what we're going to do is, the first thing you need to realise is the stuff that Hitler does and the stuff that Nazis do to keep stability are targeted and calibrated to some extent on particular groups. In addition, some of the stuff that happens and Hitler does or has an effect hits different groups differently, i.e. terror does not hit certain groups really, particularly in the early years, such as the elites and the Catholic Church. Propaganda works more for some groups than others. Some groups are more susceptible to propaganda than others. Censorship, same thing. Fear of communism, similarly, and material interest, similarly. So what makes this question hard, and what you really need to make sure you have in your notes, is actually there is a difference by time. there is a difference by factor and a difference by which group. And a good answer is able to say, of the major groups in society, in German society, some groups are more important than others. And therefore, the factors which buy off those important groups, and we're thinking particularly the church, army, middle classes, and elites, are particularly important. Likewise, when we look at resistance, you might say, well, resistance in the form of the youth is probably less damaging and less threatening than resistance from the army, because the capacity to cause carnage is lesser. And if you're not sure how or why, go back to one of my previous lessons. I think it was the last one, in fact. No, it's the start of the consolidation lessons, where we talk about what makes certain groups more powerful than others. It's stuff like size, it's stuff like the tools they have at their disposal, and that sort of stuff. So, the first thing you think about is what factor is affecting which groups, because if the army are unhappy, that's going to be a far greater threat to the stability of the people, of the state, than if, for example, socialists, who you can afford to just terrorize. Likewise, you might want to say, when it comes to how popular policies, you might say, well, some policies are popular amongst the elites, the armies, others are popular amongst the church, others are popular amongst the elites, and so on. Sorry, the middle classes, and so on. And so, whenever you ask a question, think, well, this is not, the German society and German people are not one big homogenous block. They're actually a very various block. And therefore, actually, different things might have different effects. And that gives you mileage in your analysis to add a bit more complexity than simply just stating, this has an effect. Why? Because I say it has this effect. The second thing you need to think about is the role of time. And I've sort of somewhat artificially put it into three broad categories, and obviously remember that these things are a bit more fluid. But actually, what has the effect changes, and what's important changes, and how the Nazi state behaves changes over time. And that's often dependent on the different political circumstances. The Nazi regime exists from 1933 to 1945, where it dies in a bunker in Berlin. So the first period, 1933 to 36, you can argue the Nazis are actually under the most amount of threat. They lack legitimacy, they haven't been in power for very long, they don't have complete control of the apparatus of state. Well, they will never have that, but they have even less than normal. The party itself is divided, Night of the Long Knives. The Great Depression is happening, which is hurting this situation, and therefore this requires a certain set of policies to be prioritised. So we're going to see material interest is very important, stuff that focuses on legitimacy is very important, and therefore the use of terror has to be really carefully used, because the Nazis can't afford at this stage to annoy a lot of people. They can, obviously in this era they can totally afford to persecute the communists, absolutely fine, because that's popular amongst German people, but in reality in that 1933 to 36 period, in reality there is very limited on what policies can be done, and therefore we might see what policies are popular, what policies are done, why their policies are successful, are very much focused on that sort of get out of depression, wait until we've got legitimacy, wait until we're a bit more secure, and therefore they take less risks. 1936 to 39, the priorities shift. The Nazis have been in power for a little bit longer. Hindenburg is dead. Hitler has complete power over his party. To some extent. Hitler has more power over the state. Hitler has more legitimacy and is more well known. There's control of propaganda. Opposition has been removed. He can afford to take a mick a bit more. He can afford to use terror a bit more. He can afford to try and do policies which are less popular and drop some of the more popular policies. In addition, he is now focusing on war, and that 1936 date is going to be very important for the economic question, which we're going to be looking at shortly. But he needs to first start focusing on war, and as that priority becomes about rearmament and building up weapons and that sort of stuff, some of the policies around Great Depression particularly, and giving people a comfortable material interest, shift. And so we can argue that 1936 is where we see the real shift away, starting at least, from that certain models of which one's more important. Likewise, in 1939 we then go to war, and then that trend speeds up. The Nazis are more stable. The war initially up until 1941 goes well. Nazis have a lot of legitimacy and they can get away with a lot more. But also remember, during wartime, particularly the last stage in 1942 when the war's going badly, you can justify more terror. Why? Because in wartime, you can say this is an emergency for the defense of the people. We need to be able to take more extreme measures. You can justify it. People are a little bit more distracted with the war. The elites and the army are increasingly more spread out across the entire of Europe than they were before in their sort of Berlin and Prussian estates. So in reality, what we see as we go into World War II, and particularly by 1942 as the war starts going badly, how far the Nazis can afford to, and then to some extent by the end, just give up and start using terror is going to shift. In addition, the ability for you to pay for nice policies and emphasize big ideological policies changes as you are fighting a major war. So the thing I really want to make clear here is what the Nazis can do changes by their circumstances as they go from early years, no legitimacy, Great Depression, to mid-years, legitimacy, a bit more stability, to late war, things are going badly. But also how much they are able to get away with, depending on the situation, shifts as well. And what policies are more important at a particular point changes. So what we can say is actually there's no one consistent factor across the entire period. And in your paragraphs, in your essays, you really want to be saying, and this is particularly important in the early years, particularly important in late years because blah blah blah, and less important later on. It's a really good way to add a bit more depth and nuance and balance to your answer without having to go in loads and loads of depth. Okay, so really focus on those 3 dates and really focus on what is going on in each of these times and to change the status quo. And so once we've decided look at the important groups, who is needed for stability, and once again, well, we've said particularly the church, the elites, the army, and then to a lesser extent, but still important, middle classes, and women to a lesser extent than that, because they're less politically active and less organised, youth, and because you can afford to use terror because everyone else likes it. If you use terror against them, the socialist and working classes are less important, and bureaucracy is a bit more conformed because of Gleichschaltung there. So once we decided, okay, that certain groups are more important, what groups are resisting more as time goes on? So, for example, the elites don't really start resisting until 1942 onwards, when the war starts going badly, and that's where we see a lot more resistance. And we actually see the use of terror against the elites and the use of terror against the church, because the Nazis are kind of desperate by that point. But then you need to think of what do they do to create that stability. Do they use terror, left-hand side, or do they use a range of other factors or use a range of different things to justify their existence and to justify people not to resist? So we can say there's a lack of resistance because people genuinely believe in Hitler, because of propaganda censorship, because people fundamentally have a good life, because people would rather have Hitler than communism, that people love the Nazi policies, or is it because people are scared? And that's the crux of this essay, and the crux of this question is trying to unravel. We can't dispute there isn't a huge amount of resistance. Okay, that the Nazi state is relatively stable, particularly for dictatorships. It's really stable until it burns down in 1945. Why? And what we can say is, in reality, for a combination of the use of these different areas, in which affect the key groups in here, over time there's enough calibration to fit what is necessary to keep stability. So what we're looking for is, why does it create stability? I'm going to finish off by sort of really emphasizing something that always goes wrong in these essays. Everyone will state, here's some examples of terror. They don't then explain how that terror leads to stability. How does that lead to a lack of challenge? You really, really, absolutely, please write this in big bold letters in red pen, underlined. In your analysis, it is not enough to say how propaganda theoretically works, what it is, and some examples. You need to say, why does the existence of propaganda and censorship help produce the amount of resistance, the amount of revolution, the amount of coups, the amount of whatever it is, to the Nazi state? That is the question here. Anything else is not answering the question. So, although it says, why did Nazis stay in power? You're not just going to, don't just blandly describe the factor. Say, this means that the Nazi regime stays stable because. This means that the amount of resistance is minimal because. This means that this is a popular policy because. You need to focus on the analysis here. Because we're doing big picture, these are general themes, students often don't tailor it to the question. Recycle the wording in the question. If the question says lack of resistance, you use the word lack of resistance every damn time you see you're doing your analysis. If the question says Nazi regime remain in power, you recycle the word remain in power every time. It's absolutely vital to make sure you focus on the question, and key, particularly in this spec, to ensuring you get those AO3 marks. Okay, a nice and brief introduction to what we're doing. We're going to now move on to terror, which is going to be a very long one, and then move through the various factors on the right through subsequent lessons. Until then, I will see you in the next video.